Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Coming off of our real 300th episode with Geo, that was very fun as always. I'm glad everyone
It's
enjoyed it.
hilarious.
And you know what? We just got to continue because there's always more to talk about. Quite a bit has happened in the past, let's see, about 2 weeks. I think it'll be about 13 days between this episode and last episode. And there has been some monumental shifts, not only on the battlefield in Ukraine, but also in a lot of the news related to Ukraine and just a lot of the news in the world in general. The first of which being Hunter Biden's laptop has all the secrets to this, and we're gonna get to the bottom of it. Okay, we have the most certified files. A high level leaker gave us this information. We're at
Mm-mm.
risk bringing you this very information, but you know what? You're gonna have to wait until the end of the episode for that big reveal. While we slog through some very meticulous updates about Ukraine, but you know what? You knew that when you signed up for this episode of the War Report. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, GSP, and you can get us started.
Yes. Quite a bit of updates as far as front lines are concerned, and particularly the kind of fighting. So I suppose since the last show, which was kind of unexpected, we were talking about a possible offensive by the Russians opening up in the Kharkov region. Uh, Back in March, in April, there were statements from the Russian government, including Putin, that they would need a sanitization zone. That means like basically a zone of control between Belgorod and Kharkov in order to stop the Ukrainians from shelling Kharkov. And really, in many ways, it couldn't have come sooner because I believe on the 12th of May,
Yes, May 12th, Sunday, May 12th, last week.
Sunday, May 12th, there was a missile attack. It might have been an ATACMS that hit a residential building. It caused the building to cave in the center of it. The floors were crushed. There might have been a second attack, which occurred shortly after while there were rescue teams. All in all, 19 people were killed. And in fact, I think in the last year, about 1,000 people in like outside of former Ukraine have been killed. There was also a policeman in Berdyansk, which is in the south. It is in the Zaporozhye region, not far from like the Kherson region. That I believe a deputy police officer was killed again with a car bomb. Um, in any case, let's go with the first slide. And the first slide gives us a general idea where this territory has been taken. So there are two fronts that have opened up that are side by side. Um, the of course now the Russians have encountered much larger um, settlements, including like small cities like Volchansk. Um, but we'll see other slides where they've made progress within Volchansk. But of course, that was inevitable that they would be eventually be hindered. Now, there was at the beginning reports of some Russian personnel getting hit pretty bad, and that did happen. I wasn't sure of it myself because people raised the issue that um, the insignia for the North group is not a Z, it's not an O or a V. It is a separate symbol altogether. It's an old Slavic symbol, like a pre-Christian symbol, with kind of like a combination of an X and a diamond. In any case, it does turn out that there was one setting where three vehicles were hit. There were two or three Russian soldiers that were obviously dead next to them. Further down toward Lipsy, but not in Lipsy, because this was on the first day, another five vehicles were destroyed. However, this wasn't enough, and the Russians made a lot of gains. In fact, as of let's say the 19th, the 18th of May, from the 1st to the 18th of May, the Russians captured something like 330 square kilometers. That is about 230 kilometers more than they captured in all of April. So yes, it's a lot of territory. That's true. They did move about 7 or 8 kilometers south, which was one of their goals. And the way the attack happened was in and of itself pretty interesting. Initially, it was only 2,000 men. There was an exercise, a Zapad exercise back in mid 2017 that took place. Belarus was there, and maybe even Serbia participated in this one. But in any case, they had this kind of attack where a kind of reconnaissance and force would go in. So it'd be a small force like this one, 2,000 men, stretched over several, like dozens of kilometers. So this is not a big force, and it also was not very mechanized either, despite the mechanized losses. And then on the next day, or possibly 36 hours later, another 2,000 would come in, then 10 or 15,000, and it would just build and build and build. So this is a very different kind of thing that the Russians are doing now than what they did before, because before the Russians, of course, rushed into all kinds of areas at the beginning of the SMO, and they bypassed towns that were never subdued, that had Ukrainian military and citizens that were sympathetic to the Ukrainian forces of Kiev. And this is quite different. So they've created a lot of girth and density over a short period of time. Another giveaway that they probably were intended on taking this area was plans, satellite images, even published in the Western press, started to appear of an airport outside of Belgorod that they're wanting to build. It's east of Belgorod, but that I thought was, considering where things are going and the kind of missiles that are long range that are coming. For instance, Schnaps recently, Shaps, not Schnaps, Shaps recently doubled down on Cameron's message that Ukraine should hit deep into Russian territory with their brimstone missiles and so on. So uh, so I would say, they're they're creating something. It is probably a sanitization zone. They only have about 50,000 soldiers there, and currently, at the moment, they are outnumbered by the Ukrainians. Now the numbers were pretty even on the day that the Russians moved in, and the Russians were probably outnumbered by the Ukrainians. However, most of the forces in that area are just, let's say, they're not, the only special forces are some of the ideological forces like Kraken was moved up there after being sent to Chasov Yar and other regions in the Donbass, basically to plug holes and to do active defense, and they have been moved up. Now Azov has also moved into this area. And in fact, there have been over 40 Kraken soldiers who were caught. So there's videos of Ukrainians leaving their posts. These were not the best trained, the most motivated. Basically, they're there just as cannon fodder, as bodies, early warning system. They're not going to hold out that long. And they're not probably as well equipped as units like Kraken and Azov. There are other units, motorized units, airborne units of the Ukrainians that were trained by NATO in the last year or two that have also moved in. So the Russians never had a manpower advantage. They have a firepower advantage that allows their artillery to subdue the Ukrainians. And one of the things that it seems evident now that the Russians are doing, you can go to slide number 2, and then maybe a few seconds later, just move to slide number 3, and this will be Volchansk, which is sort of the largest settlement yet that the Russians have almost captured. So one of the reasons that the Russians could be doing this, there are many reasons, and it's not just one or two, is they want to draw the Ukrainians to move their best equipment. M109s, Polish crabs, these are all mechanized, mobilized, self-propelled guns. These are not towed guns. It's, very heavy artillery, the kind that they've been using against Belgorod and in places in Donbass. Um, and they're taking them out. The Ukrainians are primarily focusing on Russian personnel. So once the Russians get into a town, then the drones come out, the small personal, like small drones. Um, in places where the Ukrainians are steadfast about not losing territory, they will use their artillery, and that has happened. There have been several occasions, let's say in the last 2, 3 weeks, there was a push towards Staromayorsk and uh, in the Zaporozhye region, well, Zaporozhye, Western Donbass region. We'll get to it. The Russians lost at least 3 or 4 armored vehicles there, but they still managed to take territory, and they have increased the amount of territory now uh, in Staromayorsk. So um, now we're looking at Volchansk, and you can see that the northern part of the town is divided by the Severodonetsk River from the southern part. The Russians took this part today, which is a pretty sizable part. Very heavy fighting. The Russians took over a hospital, and immediately the Ukrainians began using their own version of glide bombs. These glide bombs are launched by HIMARS. Remember, like the HIMARS are not a joke. They're a very good weapon, and they completely obliterated that hospital. Now, I don't know how many or if any Russians were in there or not, but the Ukrainians, they have done stuff like this before. And, in Bakhmut, they created mines to detonate the whole building so it would crash on the Russians who came in after the Ukrainians had left. We haven't seen that in 2023, but this could be something similar. Again, the video doesn't really show anything except the hospital getting obliterated. Um, so that's for Volchansk. Now, if we go to the next slide, here's a possibility, and here's why probably the Ukrainians have fought so hard for Kupiansk, because, of course, they want to prevent the Russians from taking the Oskal River. They want to prevent the Russians from taking Krasny Liman and Izium, which are very important hubs. And those two red lines show a possible access that the Russians could use after they secure the north. So these red arrows, think of these as more long term. Again, the Russians have not put in enough men to take Kharkov. For instance, just a town like Avdiivka, the Ukrainians had 60,000 men, which is which is smaller than Bakhmut. And Bakhmut is a fraction of the size of Kharkov. Okay, so people need to understand that. Like a city like Kharkov, even if you surrounded it, it would take hundreds of thousands, right? Not this,
Wasn't it
but
about a million pre-war, 1.5 million, something like that? Um,
oh, World War II, you mean?
uh, like before the war broke out. Okay, maybe like pre 2014. Let's just say for Kharkov.
Yes, like 1.2, 1.4, 1.3. That's what I see. Like
Yes.
just a little over 1 million. It's still about 2 million smaller than Kiev. Now remember, like the Russians only had roughly between 30 to 40,000 men around Kiev when the SMO started. But the Western press tried to make you believe like that was somehow the Russians thought that they were going to. No one thought that. No one in Ukraine thought that. Like, I mean, silly, like normies think that. People who want to know a little bit, but not too much because they have other things to think about. But nobody in the military honestly believed that, 35,000 guys are going to encircle and take over a city of 3 million. It's a ridiculous idea, right? So, so now the question is, what will the Russians do next? I've just outlined what they might do in terms of like if they go towards Kupiansk and Poltava, that sort of area. But then there is talk on the next slide that they could open up another front in Sumy or Chernigov. Okay, and that's what those other two other arrows are, north and west. So one of the things that the Russians have noticed is that the Ukrainians desperately cannot look weak. So anytime a new place is open, there's a new break by the Russians somewhere, the Russians know that the Ukrainians will rush reserve units, that they will rush as many reserve units to plug the hole as soon as possible. They cannot look weak. They cannot have a break. However, what I think is becoming obvious now is that the Ukrainians really do have a manpower issue. There are stories about like cities are more or less vacant. There's a truckers protest in Odessa. There's videos. Now, the video is of a guy who goes at a beach in Odessa and there's nobody there. You could argue that it's still early in the season, but you would imagine on the weekend, the weather's not too bad. It's not different than like, say, northeastern United States, southern Ontario, like the kind of weather we've been having. Very nice day today where I am. Um, it seemed odd that there was not a soul. So I'm wondering, like, why is this guy filming? Is he not afraid of getting caught? Anyhow, just to briefly return to the Kharkov offensive, the next slide is a topographical map
My
that
favorite.
shows that shows the axis of advance that the Russians are doing. Of course, they're sticking to the high ground as much as possible. This low ground area that they're facing, that is the town of Lipsy. And Lipsy is valuable because if you look at the next slide, that's the height advantage it gives you. And the city you see in the distance below the type, below the font in the sky, that's Kharkov. And what ultimately the Russians want to do is they want to set up artillery from this vantage point, right? That puts Kharkov instead of Belgorod in a constant state of panic, right? Or in a stressful state. Let's say not necessarily panic. It's also important to remember these are areas that the Russians had captured and gave up 2 years ago almost. So, or about exactly 2 years ago. Not necessarily around Kharkov, but let's say close by. They held on to them for another month or two, and then they gave up on them, I believe, sometime in June. So that gives you an idea of the Kharkov offensive, what might be in the works. A lot of these brigades, and in fact, they're not even brigades anymore. The Ukrainians just use battalions now, so about 1 or 2,000 men, depending on how depleted they are. So it's not like 4, 5, 6,000, which would be like a brigade. Again, depending on depletion. And I think, in my opinion, the Russians are not going to go after Kharkov. They're going to use this. They understand the psychology of the Ukrainians and that the Ukrainians don't want to lose any more territory. They know that if they do, the West will lose hope and that the West will lose faith in them. And this will stress out their military. So let's move further south and further east. The next slide is some of the territory that the Russians have gained near Berestove. This is an area that is just southeast of Kupiansk, a very difficult area, an area that the Ukrainians have very successfully defended. Now, last year, at the end of July, first 2 weeks of August, the Russians moved the front lines pretty successfully. In some areas, the Ukrainians managed to push them back 50%. And since then, it's stabilized. A lot of very bad Russian leadership on Sinkovka, which is the little village north of Kupiansk. A lot of people now are thinking some of the territory that they've gained in this area, Kotla Yerevka. This is a twin village, which is the larger of the two white pieces. You'll notice there's a highway. That highway stretches into Petropavlovka and Kupiansk, which is like next to it. This would be a highway that the Russians would want. But again, it's a very well defended area. The Russians have had some very good success in taking out concentrations of Ukrainian men, particularly mercs. That has been going on for about a year. I haven't heard anything in the last few months, however. If you go to the next slide, this is a kind of a close-up of the area, and you can see they're getting closer and closer to the Oskol River. Now, there has been some back and forth in Belogorovka, which is southeast of here. But honestly, it's a place that changes hands too often that I'm not going to show a slide for it. Dima thinks it's ready to fall because of some of the first streets of Belogorovka have been captured by the Russians, but I'm just going to wait it out. Next slide is the Bakhmut Chasov Yar front. And you can see that there have been some changes, particularly today. So white outlines for all these means that it's a few days old, and red outline means that it's today. And the big gains, basically, they're not that big, but they're important gains, is the Russians, after being pushed out of the micro-district of Chasov Yar, they re-entered a couple of days ago. And now they have consolidated their gains in Bogdanovka, which is just north of it. That red territory shows that they are now encroaching into Kalinina. And at the bottom, you see that they have almost completely taken the forested area. And that forested area stops right at a canal that divides Chasov Yar proper from Chasov Yar, the micro-district. The other thing that this is, this pressure that the Russians have been increasing in the Bakhmut Chasov Yar front is it's caused the collapse of Klishayevka. Now, this is the red, so that's the next slide. That big sort of red square, that is Klishayevka. That's a village that has gone back and forth with many lives lost on both sides. But you can see that the Russians have now taken back almost, like, not all, but most of what they lost to the Ukrainians after taking Bakhmut last year around this time. And in fact, they've gone, in the north, they've gone further than they ever did before. So that is the Bakhmut front. Let's look at an overall map of the front stretching all across from Ochertina, which is in Avdeevka, all the way to basically Staromayorsk and Marinka and all those towns that are on the border with Zaporozhye. So you can see tiny little gains everywhere. This has kind of like been a constant for the Russians for, honestly, for most of this year. Particularly, it's ramped up since April. And next slide is a look at the gains that the Russians have had in the last few days in the areas directly outside of Avdeevka. You can see that in Ochertino in the north, that they've consolidated all their gains in Keramik, Arkhangelsk, Solovoye, they also captured Umansk. I believe that might have been on the Wednesday, and they have expanded their control in Pervomaiske. Now they lost an area of control last week, but part of that reason is they didn't consolidate some of the territory east of there, which they have now. On on May the 5th, History Legends had an interesting video. We can go to that slide next, and it's about Ochertine. It's this would have been like April 30th when the Russians basically captured it, and there was a kind of breakdown of command in with the Ukrainians. And that's the slide where it says 9.7 kilometers, and I thought this was funny. And the next slide is the largest amount of territory that the Ukrainians took in Zaporozhye around Rabotine. Now we'll get to Rabotine eventually, but you can see that it's almost the same, and the Russians have had more success over a shorter period of time, which kind of tells you where things are gradually going. But the slide after the 8.6 kilometer, I've talked about this before, but I really like this graph because it kind of it brings together what the Russians are doing in Chasov Yar and what they might be doing in Ochertina. So that yellow line is a highway that links these two villages or settlements. Chasov Yar is like a small city. And Konstantinovka is even bigger. That's the rectangular outline that you see at the end of the yellow highway. A collapse in this area would be very significant. And again, Chasov Yar is the highest peak in all of Donbass. So it would be just as valuable as some of the territory in the Kharkov region that overlooks the city. Let's move further south into Novomihailovka. The Russians have made more gains there today, or might have been yesterday. They're again consolidating. They're working closer towards another Konstantinovka. This is a different Konstantinovka. This is much further south, not Konstantinovka around Chasov Yar, but a Konstantinovka near the next city, but south and west of there. It's important because it has a highway that connects it with Ugledar, a place the Russians have tried like at least 3-4 times to take, and very unsuccessfully with large losses, especially like abandoned tanks and armored personnel carriers. Moving further south, we have new developments in Krasnogorovka. So Krasnogorovka now, you can see the gains that have been made in the last 24 hours. The Russians are basically they've forced the Ukrainians, except for that part that's closest to the Russian gains. The rest of the city is residential, one-story houses for the most part. All the big buildings, multi-story buildings, factories and stuff, that's still, well, the Russians control some of that, but the Ukrainians also control the other portion of that. But you can see that the Russians are encroaching around them, and this is an area where Ukrainian troops have said that they are being depleted and that they can no longer hold it. Not all areas, but there's several areas like now where that is the case. The Ukrainians are finding it very difficult to hold on. And if we go to the next map, this is basically an overview of Zaporozhye. And so you can see at the right end is the area of Staromayorska and Urozhanye. So the slide after the overall map view, which corresponds to the image on the white area on the right of the overall image. This is a territory where the Russians have managed to gain. This is where they had an attack where, again, at least three, four, maybe five armored vehicles were hit, but basically the men just still kept going, and they took several meters. That is the rightmost white outline, which I found very surprising. Before that, the right side of Urozhanye is where the Russians have been making gains in the previous weeks. I didn't mention it because there's really they weren't that big. They're not significant. And then we come to the last two slides, and the first slide is, of course, the near total collapse of Robotina. So Robotina, the whole um, almost all the gains, about 85% of all the gains that the Ukrainians made last year after 4.5 months of fighting. Well, it started in June, but it ended in basically the early December is when they had like the largest expanse that they controlled in this area. And you can see all that part in the south around Verobroved, like all of that is gone now. And so the last slide shows you basically that the Russians control nearly the entire settlement, making some small gains today, and that the extremities of the settlement are in the gray zone, and except for this one line of defense, which is on the outskirts. The other thing uh, that I want to bring up is, of course, there've been a lot of attacks in Crimea. There might have been a boat that was sunk, and it was a missile ship. It could have been from ATACMS. I haven't yet seen another channel to verify this, but it's still very early, and that could very well happen. On May the 1st, there was attack in Lugansk. Now, this is something that I found troubling, but it's not completely out of the ordinary considering how many times this has happened to the Russians. Newsweek had an article about it. But I haven't seen, except for Z the Right People, nobody else has really talked about this. So there was a gathering. Now, the Ukrainians claim that there was like 100 guys and they got wiped out by ATACMS. Now, I went into that chat and somebody posted the longer video, which is nearly 7 minutes, instead of the one that's roughly 3.5 minutes. All to say, the first 4 minutes don't really show anything. So there are 4 hits. The first one is a dud, and it misses the target. The next one hits the target or is very close. The radius, they're using cluster munitions here. Then there's 2 more attacks which do not hit the concentration of men. One just hits a field. The other one hits an area where there were some trucks. Now, the thing is, in the video, and other people notice this, you can see through the smoke cloud that there are people who are walking. I'm going to try to send you that image. And I wasn't the only one that noticed, and people sort of time-stamped in the video where they showed other people walking in different areas. So I don't. Now, the Russians have not said anything about it, and the Russians. Yes, here it is. So you can't really see it in this image, but this is sort of the area that it covered. You can see to the bottom left is where the trucks and the concentration of forces. Now, the photo that the Ukrainians supplied, that's a photo of the men before the attack, right? And remember, there was a dud that went off not far from this area, and it was about 2 minutes or just under 2 minutes before the second missile landed in this area. So I have no doubt that there's probably significant losses. But remember that time back in March where the Russians were hit with another ATACMS or a cluster or HIMARS of some kind, they did mention right off that 65 of their guys were killed. This was plenty back. It was 80 kilometers. So they have a drone. Now there was a guy in the that had a drone, so this was very well coordinated. It got way past the Russians, so they thought like the Ukrainians, I guess, were not capable of going 80 kilometers in. They just, I guess, thought like 80 kilometers was enough. There was a guy in the chat that had, like, he said he had visuals of the amount of deaths that had happened and so on. So I messaged him on Friday if he could send me it, and then like within the chat, and then yesterday I asked him again in a direct in his DMs, and today he told me he doesn't have it. So I don't know. Um, it's something that I wanted to uh, get to the bottom of. There's probably somebody in the chat that knows. Probably my arch nemesis Romanos. No, he's my friend. Well, what do you mean arch nemesis? Anyhow, so the other things that have happened. Let's see. There was an American merc that got killed. An American female merc of Ukrainian descent or part
Is
Ukrainian
this the
descent that
girl
got killed.
bossing that I hear so
Yes,
much
yes,
about?
it is. Yes, it is. There was, um, I believe, like an Air Force officer that was killed in a Russian attack on one of the airports. I don't know if it was in Mirgorod or Kryvyi Rog or I have, as I remember, it was in central Ukraine. Another general was killed in Odessa 2 weeks ago, or high-ranking officer. Other attacks have been happening in Odessa as well, including the destruction of three S-300s on a German Iris radar. Um, the other thing is that the Ukrainians actually launched an attack on Belbek. No, not Belbek in Lebanon, but Belbek is an Air Force base just out of Sevastopol. And it's kind of conflicting. Like definitely, so some reports, including the Russians, are saying a MiG-31 was destroyed, an Su-35, two Su-34s. So various amount of planes were were destroyed. Now the Ukrainians claim 11 Russians were killed, but no one has. It's just Ukrainian telegram channels. We have no proof. 10 ATACMS were launched. Unfortunately, two of them got through. Now the other thing I saw was some of the planes that were parked out there were actually just really old planes, including old Ukrainian MiG-29s that that obviously are not being used. So this could be a ploy by the Russians to make them, waste their ATACMS. The Ukrainians are very, very, very focused on hurting Crimea as much as possible, right? And that's part of the reason, like, why they're hitting inside Russia, because in so much as Russia knows that if they open up a new front somewhere, the Ukrainians will rush there. The Ukrainians themselves know that if they hurt other parts of Russia proper, the Russians will be forced to act. And so there is this escalation game that is going on. The Ukrainians, I think, with even though they frantically try to stop, losing every square inch, because obviously they're not a sovereign country. Their entire existence depends on America and the West. Um, Ultimately, I think they want to ensnare Russia into like a very long war, and a war that involves taking very large cities. The Russians are finding ways to do that, to avoid doing that, but where they still trigger the Ukrainians to fight to the last man, right? And if you've seen what a toss system MLRS does, you would be shocked. So I saw some photos where like you see 31 Ukrainians that have been just burnt by this system. It is unlike anything I've seen before. So I guess the Russians they are playing this attrition game. Anyways, that's it for the minutia half an hour. Maybe now we can get into a little bit of strategy and those kinds of things.
Well, what will become of all of this? Because as we've seen just this past half hour here, very informative, actually almost 40 minutes, that clearly the Kharkov defensive lines went straight up Zelensky's nose. Now, that is by no means an original joke, but it is a necessary joke. Where the fortifications for Kharkov were pathetic given the amount of time and money that were poured into this, the amount of time and money that has been poured, time, money, training, and resources that have been poured into the Ukrainian defense industry only for it to produce this. Now, you can attribute, of course, bad strategy, which I certainly think is part of that, especially now under Syrskyi. You can attribute corruption. Once again, there's a myriad of things that you can point at, but theoretically speaking, given the amount of manpower and resources the Ukrainians had to work with after they received the billions upon billions of dollars in aid and resources that they did receive, there was a real possibility this could have been a tough and bloody war for Russia that frankly the media wants to believe it is right now, where the Russians have taken 350,000 casualties. Maybe not that high. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. But they could have. But they could
Could
have.
actually say something about that.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
the statistics that I saw, the latest Levada or whatever media zona, April marked the lowest figures, the lowest casualty figures for the Russians since the beginning of the war.
I guess those tactical assault shovels are really doing their job. But I digress. I digress. But no, in all seriousness, that is interesting to see, especially with the advances that have been made. It does very much so indicate a near collapse in Ukrainian performance, at least for the time being. Now, will they be able to recover from this? I think that's the big question. Will they be able to coax somebody else into this war? I think that's another big question here. But just looking at this war overall, just looking at what has happened since the start of this, since before the start of this, they could have made this a tough and protracted fight for Russia. Now, some argue that this war's gone on longer than it should have. The Russians should have achieved victory already. We've discussed all this before. You can go back to our previous episodes if you want to hear our takes on that. But the amount Ukrainians had to expend for the pain they've dealt to Russia is not proportionate in the slightest. And I find myself asking the question I ask every time we talk about Ukraine: how much longer is morale going to hold out? As you said, there are empty beaches, there's empty streets, not a soul to be found, because they want to avoid conscription, because the conscription drives get harsher and harsher with each day. They need more manpower. They're trying to force the issue, of course, with their diaspora, whether that be in places like Poland, other parts of Europe, eh, maybe not as far as North America, but their, of course, policy on the consular services to Ukrainian military aged men. It's becoming a scramble for manpower. And I know that Syrskyi was saying a few months ago, 500,000 men, 500,000 men, 500,000 men was the figure that was constantly quoted as being needed for the newest drive of conscription. That's clearly not going to happen. And
Yeah, no, not even close.
they Washington, who are primarily the drivers of this war, at least I would say up until recently, they did lose initiative via the Ukrainians. But Washington, who I would primarily lay the blame upon for the initiation of this war and a lot of the way this war has played out since before the beginning of it, is they cannot afford to let Ukraine fall before the election. It's just
Hmm.
out of the question. And I know the election is just a completely different topic in and of itself. But yes, you're sending me right now some of the funny yet also
Deeply disturbing.
profoundly sad photos of some of
What the
these
hell is wrong with these people? Like, I really
Ukrainian
want to know. They
graves where it's
never.
just I like I said, I'm glad you brought this up, and like this is cultural. This is the cultural erasure of a people, and I know I harp on this point all the time whenever we bring up Ukraine that Their national identity simultaneously hinges on the fact that every great figure in Russian history, every great Russian accomplishment, was actually Ukrainians, and that
Yeah.
the so-called Russians are just Asiatic pretenders from Moscow. But then, when given the chance to establish their own cultural identity, they cleanse their own cultural heroes. They tear down statues to Saint Alexander Nevsky. They tear down statues to all the great princes of the early Rus, and they say they're too Russian. And even I know that Pushkin, who I think they've also claimed at some point, I think all these great Russian figures they have claimed, they renamed streets after Western
Victoria
pop culture
Nuland.
slop. And after George Floyd, maybe that one's been an exaggeration, or Victoria Nuland or
Yeah,
Tony
that's a
Blair.
real one.
Yeah, the Nuland one is a real one. The Tony
And
Blair,
Johnson, Boris
yeah,
Johnson.
Boris
He's an
Johnson's.
honorary Cossack.
You know who else was an honorary Cossack until 2018?
Who's that?
Donald Trump.
Ah!
Yeah, yeah. I think it was the leader of the Don Cossacks on the Russian side who awarded him the title. But then when there was the standoff between the U.S. and Russia over Syria, he revoked the title for it's something like quote unquote threats against the motherland or betrayal of the motherland, so, something like that. But that
Blump blew it.
that's something that for a brief window, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson had in common. And
Did
now
you
they,
did you put up the photos? Sorry to
yes, I
interrupt
do.
you.
I do have those
Oh
up,
my
and
God,
this
they're
is
just so insane.
like I said, like they're funny on the surface. You want to laugh, but then you think about the real implications of this, and it's just
Yeah.
like
It's a cargo cult. Like, I
it's
mean, I've never seen not even Filipinos who can simp for America really, really hard, but or Albanians, right? Even they won't do this. I just, you're an Azov fighter, but you want to be buried with Lego and Oreos and a kid's Happy Meal from McDonald's. Like, I mean, it makes sense now. Like those visits of Blinken and Kuleba having French fries at the local Kiev McDonald's and then going to have pizza. Like, I guess it's real. I guess these people really are impressed by that. It lets you know just how much in the 90s these people are. Like, they live in the 90s. They believe that the promised land was to become totally incorporated with America. Then they would have more money. Um, I mean, ultimately, that's what it came down to: is a nicer pension, a future for their children, because their children are incredibly well educated, very high performing. The Ukrainians are like, but not a lot of opportunities, and they felt like joining the EU and NATO was the magic trick. Like they just had to do that. And there's no way NATO or America would ever use them.
mind you, it was out in the open. We reference this all the time. You go back to sources, open public writings in '95, I think it was, where he says that eventually there will come a point if Russia does not submit to us, we will need to use the Eastern and Central Europeans
Yes.
as a meat grinder to ground down the Russians. And I think he'd cite the Ukrainians in particular that this was their plan since the
Yeah.
90s. That if Russia did not submit, if Russia did not go down fully the path of Yeltsin, this was going to be the outcome. And this is what we're seeing right now. And sure, you can say that, if, of course, people want to be nationalistic for their nations. Yes, all of that. But you look at the Ukrainian nationalism, even under the most charitable of interpretations, at this point in 2024, is a complete and total farce. There is no Ukraine to be nationalistic for. Even their concept of Ukraine before this war started was dubious at best, with say their founding myth nationally, and like going back to the idea that every great figure in Russian history was actually Ukrainian, and that the Asiatic pretenders just stole our history from us, etc., etc., etc. That was shaky ground, but that is no more ridiculous than the story, the national myth of several nations today. So that's one thing at least. But it has degraded into to what we had just shown, into pop culture slop cargo cults. And in a way, I almost feel some degree of sympathy for the fact that people got taken in by this, but at the same time, I have to wonder, what else were you expecting? What did you think the final outcome of this was going to be? And was this worth your life? Was this worth the life of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of your countrymen? Was this worth the permanent destruction of your nation, even if it does survive in name, even if it does survive as a legal formality? The amount that you'll have to give up in resources and possibly land and manpower, in terms of both the men who died and everyone else who will leave the country and never return. At the end, when does an honorable but overwhelming odds fight become a foolish endeavor? I think is the real question in all of this. And the question is, it, when does a compromise become dishonorable? Because I know that we, especially in the wake of World War I, World War II, we're never allowed to forget that, oh, we never accepted dishonorable peace. Chamberlain, blah blah blah. All these
Yeah.
mythologies they just throw at us at rapid pace. But at what point does it become an honorable option to accept that this is a fight you cannot win? This concession is painful, but it is a better alternative to what could have been. Now, I know the Ukrainians weren't exactly determining their own national destiny here, that there were many other forces at play in this. But I'm still left asking the question, at what point did this overwhelming odds fight turn from just that into something that was just quite literally charging the machine guns and hoping the worst doesn't happen? Because they've had several opportunities to end this war. Even now, you have Putin, as of a few days ago after his inauguration, saying that, of course, we want this war ended on a negotiated settlement. Now, that's an extremely vague statement. That could mean a number of things, but it still does leave that diplomatic channel open, even if just ever so slightly. And in terms of, I know you said talk strategy, and I'm certainly here for that. But given what Ukraine has left to work with, you have to wonder, what strategy can we even realistically talk about that isn't just massive concessions and falling back to a far more defensive position? The question is, what is that defensive position? I know that we were speculating a few weeks back, not only us but several other people, about the Dnieper as a defensive line, which presents a number of logistical challenges that we got into, that a number of other people got into, simply because of the way the Ukrainian economy is structured, the way these Ukrainian cities have their supply chain set up. The Dnieper is not a defensible line. It's not a political boundary. It is a trade route, effectively. And I don't have a solid answer for what they can do. Maybe they can hope that the Russians push in too deep with too few numbers like they did the first time and exhaust themselves and have some sort of pushback where they can force the Russians to organize retreat and reset this to say what it was in early 2023. And I guess that'll just be the war until Ukraine is out of manpower and resources to do that. And the question is, do they still have the manpower and resources to even conduct an operation of that scale, even an operation of the scale of the 2022 counteroffensive? Because I think even that at best is questionable.
Yes. I don't, just to briefly return, like why asked to be buried with Oreo cookies, Lego, and like McDonald's burgers? I mean, I've seen some that are variations on a theme. They have Pepsi, for instance.
You're gonna eat
Um,
in Valhalla, okay?
like do the yes, yes, McDonald's is in Valhalla. I mean, that's what this is. This is kind of a bizarre Americana pagan merging that is happening. But what are their motives? Like, do they think like the Russians aren't jealous? Like they're laughing at them. You know, only because Ukraine, for instance, would brag that they have more toilets, even though obviously Ukraine has less toilets, less paved roads, less sophisticated country, like less
Yeah, in
influence in
terms
the world.
of economic and development and quality of life, the Russians have outpaced the Ukrainians since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union pumped a lot of money, and I mean a lot of money, into Ukraine, especially at the expense of the core Russian territories of the Soviet Union. But from 91, 92 onward, the standard of living in Russia has only gone up. The standard of living, at best, in Ukraine has stagnated. if
Or
not
gone down.
gone down. I think the only
Yeah.
now this is pre 2022, but I think the only country that was worse than them was Moldova, and we're talking
Yeah.
once again Central Asian countries too: Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. I mean Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the two very small ones. Like I said, Ukraine and Moldova still went further down than that, and especially after the Maidan, especially after this war, even Moldova in terms of economic development and wealth outpaces Ukraine.
Right. So if it's not like because I am trying to figure this out. Like obviously, it is some kind of merging of like because these are Azov guys. This kind of strange merging of American consumerism and like um, I don't know, Scandinavian paganism. Like it's so bizarre. Um, so if they're not doing this to make the Russians jealous, I guess it's really sincere then. Or is it just their way of saying, you know, only a Ukrainian would do this, not some pathetic. I mean, there really are show like an orc wouldn't do this, but a true Ukrainian would. Like, there's just no I don't think they understand. Like, the rest of Europe just is laughing at this. Like, forget Russia. Like, the rest of Europe is thinking like, you people are crazy. But I guess that's where they are, right? Like, they're tearing down any statue. They are creating, a kind of a line of distinguishment between themselves and the Russians, and everything, and that line must extend in all sorts of ways. And if it has to be like almost like a slavish worship of American culture, and like just the worst kind of American culture, then that's what they'll do. If you know, so I was completely unprepared for this. I'm sorry, I'm rambling on and on, but
No,
I'm
so no,
failing to come up with words.
I I find myself at the exact same impasse. What exactly do you say to this? And it is clownish, and it's not only this slavish devotion to American culture; it's this very transient, artificial culture. Because now I understand that much of what was American culture in a real sense has been erased generation after
Yeah,
generation. In fact, it's actually kind of baked into the cake, unfortunately, when it comes to America, where any sort
all
of
you got to
real.
do is go to a Midwestern city
Oh,
to
you're
just
telling
see what
me.
they did to the history of.
Yeah, that's. But unfortunately, that is something that is baked in the cake. That anytime any real culture takes root, it's purged,
Yep,
and
yep,
that's. And you can look at this going back for centuries. And I think the absolute latest starting point you can say is the Civil War with that. And I'd say that's actually even being a little generous with that take. And this is the American Empire. This is the fruits of it. Not only does it do that at home, it also has a compulsion to do this abroad wherever it gets involved, wherever it spreads its influence. I think post World War II Europe is probably one of the most egregious examples of this. Look at especially the the soft cultural war they waged in Germany post World War II. It it's there's no words to describe it. What they did to this nation, the ideas that they instilled. Then you look at some of the, let's just say, less occupied areas like Western Europe, places like say Italy. Maybe not. The French have always been renegades in their own right, so you can't exactly rope them in as much. Still to an extent, but not as much. The UK certainly, and especially there being no language barrier, they were affected by that. I think in a profound way. Iberia, after Franco and Salazar fell, most certainly. You look at the CIA and State Department operations there in terms of cultural influence. It's been the undermining of religion, the undermining of traditional authority. You look at some of the cooperation between the CIA and the Vatican, and like I said, I'm not even saying that to bash on Catholics too much. I mean, state and church have always had this very odd relationship, but I do think it's it is objectively true that. Uh, even if they didn't succeed, the U.S. government very much tried to weaponize the Catholic Church, and I do think they did succeed to an extent during the Cold War for a number of purposes, and to think that influence stopped after '89 or '91, I think there's no real basis to believe something like that. And like I said, you can say the same about the Russians and their church. Well, I think everyone acknowledges that. I don't think that anyone necessarily denies that, and I don't think it's anywhere near as what it was, say, in the Soviet era, or that it's even that egregious state. But like I said, it's just reality that state and church will always have this strange semi-adversarial relationship where especially the state it tries to get involved in church business. And like I said, I think applying it to one particular religious body is where a lot of people get it wrong, depending on their biases. Where yeah, it happens everywhere, it always happens. It doesn't necessarily make it right, but it's just reality that we have to talk about. But with that point aside, going back to just the complete overhaul of American influence in Europe, the introduction, excuse me, of political liberalism, sexual liberation, and like I said, I think those are the main two, but just all of these cultural ideas that we try to export it. And as I had mentioned previously, I think the Anglosphere countries are profoundly affected by this because there's just no language barrier at all. So the UK, Canada, Australia, they bear the full brunt of this because it's just a direct transmission. Whereas I know a lot of Europeans speak English, but say when you're trying to influence the Germans or the French, or there's that language barrier you still do have to cross. There is still something of a defense mechanism there. And I think that is something that has partially, I don't want to say too much, has bailed out the French in a sense because, like I said, they have had that renegade spirit when it comes to the American empire. They're slowly being reined in, as we see with Macron, despite his moments of, let's just say, uh, going off kilter, going off script, if you will. But I'm getting far off the topic of Ukraine here, but I do think it's worth mentioning that this has been the American Empire's mode of operation for virtually all of its history. That it will continue to do this, and this is the example that's given the world. And I think while it was more subtle, it was more tactful in previous years. Now that all bets are off, now that it is an out and open civilizational and ideological struggle, that they are willing to do this, that they are willing to push the issue of gay marriage, that they are willing to push the issue of quote unquote human rights anywhere in the world they can stick their nose. There's a few select areas that are just too strategically important and won't take it. Say, for example, the Gulf states, and even I mean the American Gulf state relationships since especially Biden came into office, even a little before that, is a topic of discussion in of itself. But it has been almost a requirement for cooperation with America because that is how ideologically driven this empire is, and it's
Yeah, you could also bring up Israel because the foil of the only democracy in the Middle East is used, but that's basically to cover the fact that Israel has marriage laws that restrict interreligious marriages, and they don't recognize gay marriage. Of course, there are many people who are quote unquote married and gay, and of course, Israel
Tel
has
Aviv's the gay capital of the world. But I digress.
right, right. So I mean, the U.S. State Department has run that very well. Not to mention Israel, but considering how much aid, and no one gets more aid than America. Uh, I'm, I mean, sorry, no one gets more aid from America than Israel. You could imagine them like, the American institutions, you know, uh, forcing, ham-fisting the Israelis to change some of their political and cultural um, um, status quo. Like you could imagine that, right? Like they expect it from Ukraine. They expect Ukraine to legalize marijuana. They expect Ukraine to have gay marriage, but you know, not Israel. Like there's certain thing Israel won't do, and of course we know why because you know, I mean, American itself is kind of like an Israeli colony.
I mean, forget American exceptionalism. Let's talk about Israeli exceptionalism.
Yeah, exactly.
They
So
yeah, they are the country that that is allowed to do whatever other Western country cannot, and they can dress it up in all these words. But I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And like I said,
Yeah, I mean that's the buy-in, right? Like in a way, America is also doomed to have a permanent revolution, right? You have the power structure, but a power structure without an ideology eventually becomes it's too pragmatic. Or you're going to have to create an ideology around the pragmatism, right? One way or another, you're going to have to do that because just the way human beings are. Um, and so for America, the buy-in, the convincing why power must do these things, often unpleasant things, is because, well, America is a democracy. And you could, one way or another, you could say that America's history and why it's only had 12 or 13 years of peace where it wasn't at war with somebody. Um, you could argue, well, they're doing it because of the buy-in for democracy, or it's some pragmatic concern for power, but very rarely is it just only one of those two things. And more often than not, it leans on the soft power, on the buy-in of democracy. And, you know, um,
And on top
it
of that,
always,
America's geography also makes it the ideal location if you do want to be a state in perpetual revolution that is interested in exporting this to the rest of the world.
that's
There's
right.
there's
That's
no
right.
rival empire that can keep them in check. If the Germans did this, if the French did this, even if the Russians did this, you could very easily build a coalition against any of these nations, as we've seen several times in history when every other nation in Europe has targeted one. It's like I said, it's
Yes,
told
because
its
you don't
European
want
history
the
itself.
revolution to spread.
But with America, that's simply not an option. They're not going to mount a transatlantic invasion.
Yeah.
Canada isn't able to do it. Mexico isn't able to do it. It's just out of the question.
Yeah. Yeah. So America is always going to be in this permanent revolution. It's always going to hinge on equality, or now it will be equity, but that's because, the results must be equal. Uh, and if they're not, then we have to uh, put in social mechanisms that will guarantee equal outcomes. There's always some kind of a leveraging, right? There can never be a hierarchy. And, you know, generally speaking, this works on the young, but they're serious about this buy-in because if they weren't, they wouldn't have such mass immigration of non-Europeans. So they're serious about it. As I've always said on this show for many years, like America, deep down, they portray themselves as the second ark, the second Noah's Ark. The safe place where the new world can start again. And essentially, America's mission has been to destroy any civilization, any political structure that doesn't look like it, right? Like it wants mini Americas everywhere. And in a way, that's why, like, they must be both pleased and laughing their heads off, watching like Ukrainian men have their coffins, pilfered with like American artifacts like Oreos and Lego and McDonald's and Coca-Cola and whatnot. Like, I mean, it's never
It's a,
worked
it's
better.
it's a gross parody of the Soviet Union in the 1980s that was entranced with Western excess, that was entranced with Western prosperity. The idea that
Yeah, blue jeans.
the Iron Curtain fell from blue jeans and rock and roll. It's that taken to its most absurd extent. And
Yeah,
you want to think, oh, that's just a parody, that's just an exaggeration. But no, this is reality. This is what we're looking at.
yeah, yeah. It's crazy.
It's the children of the people who bought into that mythology, and then of course, it being what they were raised with, it being what they were taught from the time they can remember, of course, took it 100% seriously because there was always a grain of salt with the generation that, of course, adopted it. Like they, of course, at least I would think most of them understood that. Yeah, okay, this is a bit of ideal. It's something that we look at, but when they raise their children with this ideal, they're going to think that that's reality. That's something to be strived for, and it's like I said, it's both the logical conclusion and the absurd parody wrapped into one.
Yeah,
And I guess that's what you can pull out of Ukraine. But we can go on some more optimistic news if you want, because there's plenty of stories out of Europe that we can.
Yes.
So
Oh yeah, there's lots of big
I'll
stories.
start with the chain of events that I feel set this off, because we'll get into the stuff about Slovakia later. But preceding that was Xi Jinping's visit to Europe. Now, he visited three countries in particular. That was Serbia, outside the European Union, Hungary, the renegade of the European Union, and France, one of the de facto leaders of the European Union. He met with the respective heads of state, and heads of government, at least in the case of Hungary, where I don't know if he met with the Hungarian president. Like, so I don't want to get too far into the details of that. But he had a very successful visit with Vucic and Orban, and it went very well. It was very friendly. There was a very warm reception of China, and it was, like I said, the grandiose presentation where you have Xi Jinping arrive, the flags of China with the flags of Serbia or Hungary, respectively, side by side, emblazing the arrival. You all know the imagery here. I don't need to get into too far of details about this. Very friendly and cooperative relationships. China puts its weight behind Serbia and Hungary in terms of economic investment, especially, and in terms of working towards. They didn't go as far as a strategic partnership, but they expressed their intention to move towards a strategic partnership with one of those, like I said, one of the last European countries that is outside the EU and NATO, Serbia. Understandable, especially considering the fact that its relationship with the West, it's on shaky ground. It's not as bad as say it was during the '90s, certainly not, but it's not the best either at this point, despite some moves towards European integration. And then Hungary is the much more peculiar case. You have Orban, who for the past almost decade has been the renegade of the European Union, whether that be on issues of migration, issues of social values, and more recently, Ukraine and the role of European foreign policy. He has been going against the grain on all of those issues for a number of years. Now, that's not to say the man doesn't have his pitfalls, because he does, certainly. And we could get into some of those at a later point, but like I said, I don't want to dwell too much on that now. But I think what you can't deny, love him or hate him, is the fact that he has consistently gone against the grain of Europe mostly for better, but in some cases, and not necessarily even tied to his policy towards Europe. There's some things left to be desired, but I don't want to touch too much on that now.
Mhm.
So Xi Jinping goes over there. He has very successful visits, making inroads in Europe, because China is the real last economic lifeline outside of complete American domination Europe has after the sanctions against Russia. Now, I know that there has been workarounds that, for example, Kyrgyzstan has become a country that has been vital for evading sanctions. There's been countries all over the place that have been vital for evading sanctions, have been the third party middlemen. I think India is one of them, even China is one of them, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. These countries, especially when it comes to the oil trade, have managed to help Europe circumvent the sanctions. And even there's been some cases where they engage in what's outright smuggling activity, where they will meet up with European ships in international water and trade off the oil. And say, oh, we just got the oil. It's just came on, got it ourselves. It's not Russian oil, and of course they let it slide because the energy needs outweigh whatever ideological crusade they're on. So there is some baseline of pragmatism left, at least. But China comes into the more dissident states of Europe and establishes that we are your friend, we are your economic partner, and we're going to continue this relationship, and we expect great things. And sure, you can say what you will about the Chinese, you can bring up a number of criticisms against them, both, I would say, in some cases valid, other cases uh, a little bit ridiculous, if we're being honest. Some of these complaints get very pedantic, but I don't want to get into that. But given the options Europe looks at now, even if you're not a fan of the Chinese, whether that be you personally or the perspective of these European states, it's keeping all of your options open. It's receiving investment from anywhere, and we're talking about the second largest economy in the world. There's a very real chance of displacing the American position for top economy in the world within the next 3 to 4 years here, depending on how economic trends go. But you have one of the world's most influential men come into these pariah, what are effectively pariah states in Europe, and say, "We're on your side. We have no problem with what you're doing. Continue doing what you're doing, and we'll continue to work with you." And of course, there was the token visit to France, which didn't really see much. But in terms of a visit to Europe, they needed to visit one of the major countries. Olaf Schloss is a bit of a clown. Not that Macron isn't, but certainly Schloss is. And his very cold reception during his state visit to China, I doubt that was going to open the door for any sort of German-Chinese summit anytime in the near future. So Xi Jinping did finish off his trip by going to France, and it, not much of great significance was discussed there. Particularly the meeting between him and Orban has been the focus of this, and rightfully so, because it does show a potential alternative path for the European Union, especially as the war in Ukraine draws down, especially as the American empire's confidence is called into question. That what did seem like an American stranglehold on Europe, I'm not saying certainly, but might have an out, might have an alternative route. And we'll have to see how that develops in the meantime. But I do think that it does present something of a lifeline for Europe, where they can, even if they don't pick one side or another, they can still straddle this line. They can still get investments from outside the U.S. That China, I know that there's been some sanctions, there's been some attempts at trying to put pressure on them, but at this point, it's just too large for the U.S. to really confront head on. So there's not much they can do about that. Now, maybe they'll crack down on European firms for uh, whatever ridiculous policy they want to go on, whatever ridiculous regulation they want to go on, try to influence European politics there, lean on the European Union, lean on Brussels in order to try to enforce some of these, let's just say, more absurd rules in order to block out China. But even if they were to try to implement that, that's going to be an effort. Like I said, you're talking about a country that is objectively an economic titan. It is the second largest economy in the world, and like I said, it's a very real possibility they could displace the U.S. by the end of the decade for that title. Now, will they? Won't
Mhm.
they? I think that there's a lot up in the air with that. But point being is they are a force to be reckoned with, and they have shown that they are willing to take, at least tepidly, a side in this brewing discontent among European states.
Right. It doesn't really matter whether China is first or second. They are at a state, at a size, and at a level of influence that America does not want. So, um, so that's basically the long and the short of it. Now, um, there were some very interesting things that happened. Of course, the Russians went to Beijing after Xi returned from Europe, and of course, everybody's talking about the hug that Xi gave Putin before Putin's departure with his entourage. Now, Putin's entourage, of course, had Shoigu even in civilian clothes. All kinds of gifts were given to each of the delegates, and back and forth between both sides. Now, the hug that Xi Jinping gave, of course, he gave Macron this hug as well. And in Chinese culture, which is much, much more restrained, uh, um, uh, uh, a hug would have to be read as highly significant.
Or we turn she white, either or. It's, a, it's up to interpretation, in my opinion, but I digress.
No, no, I think we're looking at some very strong messaging from Xi Jinping. That's what this is about. Now, why would he give both of them a hug, right? Obviously, I think it's for different reasons in each case, right? So Macron is renowned for being schizophrenic. He says one thing one day and completely the opposite the next day. Um, Sometimes people pay attention to him, sometimes they don't. The most recent schizophrenic fiasco has been his statement that he might send in French troops. Um, and then, he's not asking for an Olympic truce. He still wants to speak to Putin. He's completely all over the place. Now, part of the reason for this, one person argued that I was listening to, is that the deep state in France is not the same thing as Macron and his administration, or even the political elite. Of all the European states, France is, even now, which seems very unlikely, but is probably the state that is the most capable of forging an independent path. At least that's what its history has been. Certainly, it's been its history in the 20th century compared to other states. So Xi, in a way, is asking Macron to live up to this reputation, which Macron probably cannot. So it's putting him on the spot, which is very different than Xi Jinping hugging Putin. Obviously, the Americans know by now that there is no separating China and Russia. And our show has been saying this for 5 years, 5 years, when when many other shows were still coping. Some of them as late as 2021, 2022, especially after Biden, spoke with Putin in Vienna in June after, the near beginning of the war, where he said, the stuff we've all heard 1,000 times over. Russia is going to be swallowed up by China, and it's going to lose its independence, and there's all this kind of hand rubbing that's going on. Well,
Like I say, you
metaphorically.
can go back, you can look at this, and this is an argument I still make today that while China does have a great amount of economic might, I've never denied that. Because of resources, especially energy resources, the relationship is always tilted slightly in Russia's favor when it comes to Russia and China.
Right, and it's not clear on every issue who is the senior partner between Russia and China. China might be producing and giving the chips that Russia needs for its war machine, but it's Russia who's doing the innovation. And much of Chinese innovation depends on first the innovation that the Russians are able to make.
And let's also talk about just sheer brazenness. Putin went into Ukraine. You can say it took him too long. You can say he didn't do it right. Putin went into Ukraine. Taiwan is still effectively
Yes.
independent. Now, I know, and I'm one of the people who make the argument that Taiwan will probably be solved diplomatically, that it'll probably be a soft Chinese conquest at some point in the eventual future. I'm not going to put time on that. But I still do think, given the current circumstance we're working with, that is the case. But in terms of when it comes to who was actually willing to pull that figurative and literal trigger, it was Putin. It was the Russians.
And the other thing about this visit by Xi and the Russian delegation going to China, of course, they're signing a document that's 8,000 pages long. They've already read this. This is a formality. They want the world to see this. And it comes on the heels of both Janet Yellen's visit and Blinken's visit. Blinken's visit, of course, was terrible. Blinken made threats of what they would do, and what does China do? It dumps the largest amount of U.S. treasuries of any country ever, and they will continue to do this because I think they understand that the American empire is primarily a financial empire. That after over 2 years of this war, America and the West have still not shifted to a proper war footing, have not revitalized or created new factories for the war effort. Now, of course, in their calculus, they don't need to. We have thousands of Bradleys. We can do this indefinitely. Blah blah blah. Um, but that's not enough. And I think I think China understands this. China understands that there will be some kind of a showdown with the Americans, that it's inevitable, and that one of the safeguards is that you have to get rid of U.S. treasuries. Now, a lot of the power of the U.S. is dependent um, on the US dollar itself as the world trade currency, and them dumping this off. Of course, it's in the big picture, it's a small amount, but it's still the largest amount ever. And it will not be a blip. It will be the course of how things will go. And when they start accelerating this way, that will not only build more confidence with other countries that are paying attention. Of course, China knows that its assets can be frozen. That day is probably very soon on the horizon, and they have to prepare for it. And yeah, so you know, a lot of people don't believe the West will go into Ukraine. I mean, the West has not prepared themselves for a long, drawn out conventional war, which makes them doing something in order to win that that much scarier. And I see basically these machinations by China is reflecting that. Of course, there's deals for electric cars, and China, of course, is the largest manufacturer of electric cars, and there were some deals that they have put in place with France, but there are potential deals, as far as I understand, with Serbia and Hungary. Now, Macron tried to bargain with Xi in saying that we could do even more factories here for you if you stop helping Putin, and if you recognize that the freezing and the taking of Russian assets is legitimate. So look at that. Um, you have this head of state who is saying that China can legitimize this. China's opinion is that valuable. Of course, China isn't going to go along with this. Right? They're not stupid. Um, so it we're seeing an escalation on the bigger picture, the bigger geopolitical picture.
Absolutely, and I think that as you'd said before, anyone really paying attention could have seen this from a mile away that China was not going to drop everything and cooperate with the West. There has been concessions occasionally to Western policy, but it's not going to be another Sino-Soviet split. They're not going to exploit it the second time in a century. They already threw away their advantage in say 2014, and it's simply not coming back. No matter what they try to do, no matter what trick they try to pull, given current circumstances, they're not going to pull that move twice in one century. That was a master stroke of diplomacy on the part of Nixon, Kissinger, and their team. And like I said, that's given circumstances both then and now, it's not something you can simply replicate. And I think they took that for granted that we can just crack them apart once again. We can play this game in perpetuity. We can play them against each other until the end of time. No, it was never going to work that way. They failed to account for the fact that they undid, like I said, one of the greatest masterstrokes in diplomacy in in the past 150 years, and this is what they have to show for it. Uh, from much more intelligent men and thinking that they know better. Like I said, regardless of what you think of say Kissinger, though, and his ilk, they accomplished a great feat, and nobody can deny that. But
Right.
this is what they chose to do with that legacy, and this is the consequence that we're living through right now. It's not going to happen. There's not going to be the pivot to aged Obama. There's not going to be any of this because they've painted themselves in a corner. They've shot themselves in the foot. I don't know how many different ways I can say the same thing. The fact that they've just completely screwed themselves in that regard, and
Yeah.
they're not coming back from that. And that's on top of all the other self-imposed problems that they have brought about. Let's just say in the past decade, to be generous.
Right. And the other thing about the Chinese, now we've discussed on the show that in the mid 90s, it was actually the Chinese who approached the Russians about increasing trade, right? And this was Russia at its weakest point. But from what I found out, the Chinese were already proposing this in the very late 80s, near the end of the Soviet Union. My guess is that the reason they didn't um, concede to making, well, not concede, that would be the wrong word. The reason they didn't um, foresee greater economic integration with the Soviet Union is it was probably just too big. And they were probably afraid that at that time they would be swallowed up by it. But however, by the 90s, obviously that wasn't the case. And as time moved on, it was already looking more and more of a mutually beneficial relationship.
And I mean, at the same time, China also made billions in investments across the former Soviet Union, the former Eastern Bloc as a whole. You look at their
Yes,
investments in places like Poland, Romania, all these places that will warn you why they hate the communism of the East, taking billions of dollars in Chinese investments. Explain that one.
right, right. I mean, China's more of like, honestly, it's more of a fascist state than it is a communist
Yeah,
state,
no,
like in many ways.
like I
Like,
said,
I don't know why people go on with that.
like I said, I don't disagree, but like just speaking, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you're,
No,
you're
I know you.
yeah,
I know where you're
you're
coming from.
gonna
I
yammer on about
absolutely
communism, but like, oh, here's 20 billion from China, no big deal.
right. So yeah, so I think there have been times I think if you went from like 2008 to 2000 and I don't know even 15, 16, the Chinese are still kind of playing it safe, but really I don't know. I think from 2019, basically the plan is set, and there's nothing in the last 3 years that could convince me that where Russia and China relations are now could have been any could have reflected any other kind of scenario than what we have now. There's just no way. Um, you know, the Chinese, of course, they can pretend like yes, on some level, and this is why like they have to be careful with how many U.S. Treasury bonds they dump, is because like US debt has a way of being this kind of ticking time bomb for even the countries who want to jettison their US Treasury bonds, right? That is, if China does this, they could lose really big, but they have to do this, and they're going to do this as gradually as possible, but at an accelerated pace, right? Because they know where things are going, and they know that if there is going to be a military confrontation, America will want like a very quick victory, right? Now the problem is, even if America takes out most of China's navy, China itself would probably do similar damage to the American navy, and then it would take many years for the Americans to rebuild. Because again, as we've said, they're not on a war footing. They're not on a footing that can replace those losses, whereas China could replace those losses at a much faster rate if economically they're not overwhelmed. But of course, America also would be overwhelmed economically to some degree, because this would be a direct challenge to the dollar. And the ability to just print money and not worry about the debt is the only country who has this luxury is America. No other country has this luxury.
And then the add on
So
top of the confidence of the dollar is the hegemony of America, the fact that it is the unchallenged power. So therefore, their currency by default is valuable. It's the most valuable in the world because it's the unchallenged power that nobody is going to interfere with our trade, nobody's going to interfere with our economic productions. When that illusion goes out the window, the U.S. dollar becomes like every other currency.
yes, yes, and you're seeing in a gradual move away from the American dollar. Every year, there's more examples of it, not less, and it will go this way because basically Americanism, American liberalism, which we have been talking about on this show, this episode in particular, is has been rejected. It is rejected. Um, So America's messianic message is being rejected, and that is what's worrying. And I suppose this can sort of dovetail into, if you want, to some of the European news, especially considering Robert Fico.
Yes, Robert Fico's assassination attempt. That
Yeah,
took place on, let's see, that would have been Friday at this point. Thursday. Yeah, Friday during the day, because I remember seeing this on Telegram, that Robert Fico had been shot. Now, there was a complete lack of context at first, as these things always happen, but as it went on, it turned out to be some 71-year-old man who was part of the Slovak Progressive Coalition, Slovak Progressive Party. Point being is the main opposition to Fico's coalition. Now, Fico is an interesting character politically. Uh, Immediately, the media came out to brand him far right, an ally of Orban, an ally of Putin, all the stuff that you would normally expect. But the man comes from an ostensibly left wing background. Now, that's not to be confused with, say, the American left wing, but very economically left wing. But on the social issues,
right wing.
he echoes popular sentiment in the country in terms of traditional marriage, in terms of just traditional values in general. At least lip service to religion. I don't know how much of a practicing Catholic he actually is, despite his claims. But point being is, like, he's not out to make an enemy of the Catholic population of Slovakia, but far from. And his coalition partners are actually the right wing nationalist party. So it's a combination of, I guess if you want to dig up an old term from 2018 2019, it's the Nosbol state of Europe, the socially conservative, economically leftist state, which it, it seems to work well for Slovakia. This is not his first stint in office, and he has governed with remarkably similar policy in the past, where he is on the economic left, but socially he does not kowtow to what you can eventually think of as left wing. In fact, goes in the quite opposite direction, which earned some allies on the right, hence the current coalition. But there were shots fired at him after he was exiting a cabinet meeting on Friday morning, Slovakia time. And for most of the weekend, he was unconscious. They did put him in an artificial coma in order to address some of the internal damage from the gunshot wounds. He did regain consciousness around Saturday evening Slovakia time and was responsive, was communicating. His condition is still dire. This could still come back to haunt him, but as of now, it has largely stabilized from the
Yes.
previous news reports I've seen. But it was it's seemingly an out of the blue assassination attempt. Then, of course, you have death threats levied against both Orban and, strangely enough, you have death threats also levied against Donald Tusk of Poland as well.
Hmm.
And it was just this swelling of political violence and threats of political violence. Now, from the interviews, the snippets of the interviews I've seen with the attempted assassin of Fico, he was one of these NGO leftist activists, one of these the exact kind of people that you would expect. I think the organization was called something like the Rainbow Coalition of Slovakia, and I'm not making that up either.
Right, or like the Serbian anti-violence
Oh
coalition,
yeah,
except they got violent
oh yeah. They,
when
they
they
were the
tried.
group that kicked off the riots. Just try to explain your way around that one, but what are you going to do with that? But in terms of, yeah, because the he was part of some organization called like the Anti-Violence Coalition, which was remarkably similar to Serbs Against Violence.
Yeah,
But
I mean, it's an American-run NGO.
yeah,
It's basically the National Endowment for Democracy, which is essentially the State Department is giving these NGOs a job that the CIA used to do in the 70s and 80s.
yeah, it's outsourced like everything else since the 1990s. It's a lot easier. It's a lot more deniable way to put it in the hands of these human rights organizations, as they'll call them, because it's softer than the CIA, which garnered itself quite a nasty reputation during the Cold War, and not without not without reason, of course. But it makes it easier, and then of course that attracts the cash of people like Soros and other like-minded wealthy elite who pump their billions upon billions upon billions into these causes. And I guess the rest of the story kind of tells itself in that regard. But
Yeah, he did say that the day before he was shot that he would refuse any more cooperation with the WHO. He also made statements about kicking out the Soros open society groups within his country, just as Orban had done. Of course, Russia did that years ago. Um, you always have this, right? You always have Soros goes in, and then eventually, if the regime doesn't fall, more harder methods are used with like various radicals within that country or ethnic groups that have radicals within them are used to mobilize against the government at that time that they want removed. You're seeing a bit of this in Georgia, although not quite there yet. Um,
yeah, it turns
but
out the ethnic strife in Georgia, the Russians already capitalized on that one. It's too late for that. But um,
yeah, yeah, the president, she said that she needs Macron to come with her. Like that is insane, right? Um, Armenia needs France's help, and because of course she's vetoed it, but the ruling party can overturn her decision, and it's going to go through because I mean it went through the third vote. It's a foregone conclusion. Now the only thing that can stop it is violence.
oh, absolutely, it's going to need to be like Maidan street violence in order to put an end to this. And like I said, this was the anti-foreign agent bill, which was pro-Russian by wanting to. I mean, I guess in a way it was implicitly pro-Russian because of the way it does target the NGOs and the fact that Russian state influence isn't necessarily through NGOs, at least not in the same way that say Western influences. The NGOs are very much a Western style instrument of enforcing power at home and abroad, for that matter. But it it was interesting because you have the president veto it, but the veto is going to get overridden. Now, what street demonstrations they have up their sleeves, I'll be eager to see that. I know there were some rumblings of that in past couple days that was going to come to that, and then what came out of this is that Turkey said it's going to look into a similar law, that's going to try to pass a similar law
That's right.
in
That's
order
right.
to. And there was one other country that had said something of the same effect, that it's going to move towards the registration of NGOs and the cracking down on them. I can't remember what it was, but I know Turkey in particular was the other one that.
Turkey's the one that stood up for me. You're right. There is another country, but I just can't think of it right now.
It was somewhere else in that region. It definitely not Armenia, no, and also not
No.
Azerbaijan, but it
But you know
was.
what's funny about this, what you just said about Turkey, is that Turkish media said on the 12th and 13th of this month, so just like, a week ago or less, that they had discovered plans for another coup attempt against Erdogan, which is crazy because a few days later, the Serbs arrested a suspect that was plotting to assassinate Vucic. All of this came out like before Fico was shot, and Fico survived. Something like four shots penetrated him. Two of them went into his abdomen. He was operated twice, but as you said, he is in stable condition now. He is going to make it, but the question is, you know, how is he going to make it? What will be left of him? What kind of a Robert Fico will there be after this? Right? It's like,
I mean, and this assassination attempt also comes off the heels like 3 or 4 weeks after Pellegrini got elected to the office of the president, which a longtime political
yes,
ally of his.
that's
So,
right.
so in terms of like, even if worse comes to worse, and Fico either succumbs to his injuries, which is highly unlikely at this point, or they end his career because of just physical complications and I don't know, potential brain damage, depending on what exactly the gunshots did to him. I can't be quite sure with that until we see everything that happens. His coalition is pretty solidly in power, both
Yes,
on the legislative and the executive side.
despite what the Western media wants you to believe, that it's a deeply divided country. I mean, he won pretty handedly. The other bit of news is there was an election in North Macedonia, and the right wing opposition won. Now, if you read the Reuters articles, like there isn't that much to be said about it. Like there isn't really that much substance to it. But I watched an interview with Kit Klarenberg, and he lives in Serbia, and so he's very familiar with Serbian and Macedonian politics. And apparently, the president is, I think it's Mitsovsky or Mitsovsky, who won. Um, he or his party has said something like, "There's no such thing as North Macedonia. We're going to reject this name." And there are talks about them leaving NATO. So the last country to join NATO could be the first to leave. Maybe Xi Jinping did not visit Macedonia, of course. But he was in a neighboring country, and as far as I understand, Macedonia's biggest trade partner is with Serbia,
And I am
and
curious in terms of the
Serbia has a
election.
lot of influence on Macedonia. So go ahead.
In terms of the election, I know that the name issue came up with the election of the right wing opposition, but uh, what was this? What was the role of the Albanian minority in Macedonia? Was that a key issue in this election? I imagine it would be, just given
Yeah,
how much of an issue it's been lately.
one of his cabinet members said something like, we're returning Macedonia to the Macedonians, and some people that were interviewed. There's a lot of disillusionment, right? Like, I would say since 2005, there's been a small clique of Macedonians who definitely want to be part of the EU. Again, it's the same idea. If we just join the EU, we're going to have better lives, right? There's no way they're going to use us. We're just going to have better lives. Just join the EU, just go along with it. We're obviously incapable of ruling ourselves, and we can't project that kind of power, et cetera, right? They'll never be this frank about it, right? And I personally think that after the pro Soros, because of course Soros was responsible for the so-called Šarena Revolucija. I mean, it's literally like the color. It literally means like the colorful revolution. Like it's ridiculous,
They
but
couldn't even pick a color.
it couldn't. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, their posters had like yellow, blue, pink, red, whatever.
All the colors of the rainbow.
That's right. So I don't know. I think time will tell because sometimes these politicians have a lot of bluster. Um, I would say at the moment I'm a little hopeful, a little hopeful. We'll see. We'll see. Yeah.
I am curious, and because you had brought up the very clear tactic of the NGOs of the State Department to mobilize ethnic tensions, if we will see some great Albanian protest in the next few weeks here, because
We might not. We might not. A lot of Albanians are leaving Macedonia
oh
as they
wow,
are Kosovo. So because they have greater integration now with the EU. They're using like Macedonia and Kosovo as jumping off points to leave those areas and to go to EU countries or Western
yes,
countries like Britain. I mean,
uh,
they have a lot of human trafficking business going on. Real entrepreneurs.
isn't that just the cherry on top of all of this? That the breakaway states, the breakaway regions they tried to form out of the collapse of Yugoslavia, they're not voluntarily depopulating themselves from, because there's better Western prospects at home in Albania in order to go abroad with their integration in the West. You have to love how
I
their own
haven't seen
projects
any protest. I've
it
seen no protests so far.
their own projects is just collapsing on itself in the Balkans. And not only here, but like going back to Serbia, going back to the so-called Serbs Against Violence with Vucic's re-election, that movement fizzled out.
Yeah.
Like I said, Bosnia is coming apart at the seams. You have the comments from Dodik about bringing up the question of secession again. Now, whether he'll actually go through with that, I think that's an entirely different discussion. But point being, it's being discussed once again. Just the entire Balkan project, and uh, even the issue they had in Montenegro with the election of the government, um, with the schismatic church they tried to start there. That was
Yeah.
nothing came of that. Um, their coalition lost. That was like 2021, 2022 when they fell out of power. And
Well, speaking of churches, the Church of Tithes in Kiev was completely demolished this week.
I did see that, yes, which
Yeah.
I wish I could say I was shocked.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
but
terrible.
but this is what it's come to, and
Yeah.
but what just to finish off, like I said, the project in the Balkans has failed. It's massive egg on its face for the U.S. and what's the attempt for reentrenchment? What are they going to have the British take the nuclear option and start assassinating a bunch of Bosnian Serb leaders in order to prevent some sort of secessionist movement? Because that is a contingency plan the British do have, and are they just going to hand over operations to MI6 or whatever to try to keep this? I mean, not that I think this region is going to ever see any great form of political unity, but are they just going to just say, let's say, exacerbate the current fracture lines? Do they even have the ability to do that anymore? Is it even a priority at this point to keep the Balkans, let's just say, even more fractured than they would be on their own? And I don't think that's a priority in the face of both the Ukraine war and in the face of, say, uh, the wars in the Middle East right now. Now, some would argue this could be the second front that they want to open, but I do think they tried that, and I think it failed when they tried to push against Vucic in his reelection, and it just the front is frozen over, so to speak. There's no real progress they can make in the foreseeable future with any of this. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not wrong in this case, but it looks like there's just no avenue to continue forward with their plans for the time being, given the resources that they have and where they need to allocate them.
Yeah.
But I suppose that being said, we can move on to the cabinet shuffle in Russia.
Hmm.
And that is, it turns out that Shoigu, in traditional Tuvan culture, Putin has betrayed him and fed him to wild pigs, is what the media would have you believe. Like, you can say a lot of things about Putin, but he's a tolerant man. He's giving him an end that is worthy of respect of his people, or at least what I imagine. I don't know what they would say about Tuvans in the Western media. I mean, how many Western journalists do you think have ever even heard of a Tuvan? How many of them? I mean, frankly, they probably think that Shoigu was half Chinese for all they know. But I'm getting too far off topic here. So Putin was officially reinaugurated after his reelection in March, and there was a little bit of shifting of positions in the cabinet. Now, most of it stayed the same. Lavrov is still on. A lot of the big names are still on. Shoigu, who has been a target of immense criticism since the start, since the February 2022 intervention in Ukraine, the SMO, the war, whatever you want to call it, has been a target of sharp criticism, even from Russians and those who have their sympathies with the Russian war effort. And I do think it comes from somewhat of a misunderstanding of his job, and I do think that there are criticisms you can certainly put down, but him as Minister of Defense, it was a civilian role in coordination with the military, particularly related to military logistics. And that's what most ministers of defense are. They're not in charge of, say, military operations as a whole. It's not exactly a military position. A civilian could very easily hold that position. In fact, the his replacement, Brusilov, I believe that's his name. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. Is an economist by trade and has been influential within the Putin government for a number of years now, a number of decades now. But Shoigu has been moved to the Security Council, of the Russian Federation. Now, some might think this is demotion, some might think this is some sort of sidelining, but the Security Council is a influential organization. I'm certainly not the first to say this. I'm certainly not the only person to say this. The successor to the Soviet Politburo, even in fact, meets in their former office on a weekly basis, and Shoigu has been put into that position. I believe he is currently vice chair of the council, and I wasn't I wasn't clear about it. I couldn't find an exact answer. He either replaced Medvedev in that position or is like a co-vice chair in that position. But I know a lot of his role on that council is particularly about military industry. Once again, we're talking about a man with an engineering background, so in terms of technology research and development, that's going to be his bread and butter. That's where he's going to be comfortable, and he has been moved to a position where that is what he's going to focus on. And of course, he's still very close to Putin. He's still within Putin's ear. He's something of a founder of the Russian Federation, going back to the early days of drafting governing documents and the formation of governing institutions of the Russian Federation, going back to 91, 92, 93. He was pivotal in that. I believe he was actually part of Yeltsin's administration for a time as well. But point being, has been an influential figure in Russian politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he's a monumental figure. He's a little bit larger than life. He's hard to remove from the governing system of Russia. I would say so long as he's alive and of able mind and body. And it looks like this trend continues. It looks like Putin has moved him into, I would say, a much more fitting position given his skill set. Now, you could get away with having him as defense minister during a time of peace or relative peace, but now that the war has broken out, now that he has garnered some criticism, especially from his main critic, who's now dead, Prigozhin, um, levied harsh criticism against him. In fact, one of the goals of Prigozhin's stunt back last June was the removal of Shoigu from office, and that was one of his primary stated goals. Now, of course, he never got to live to see that. At least, as far as we know, he didn't get to live to see that. But uh, and who says he would be satisfied? Because this is something of a promotion. Like I said, I'm far from the only person to say this, but given the role and the influence of the Security Council, uh, this is a move up. This is something that is probably, like I said, a pretty good move. And I really can't complain. I do think that a lot of people are, especially in the Western media, especially from the people you expect, are eager to make a far bigger deal out of this than it actually is. But it is interesting to see for the first time in, I would say, several years, since at least 2012, seeing that major a shift within the Russian government, especially during wartime, where nobody would have really expected this. I wasn't expecting this. The fact that there would be some minor rearrangement of the cabinet and, let's say, Putin's inner circle and the Putin administration. And it, I think, frankly, it was the right call in retrospect now that I've been given the information that we do have to work with. That and it makes sense. It makes perfect sense why this happened. And we'll see what comes of this. Perhaps having a number cruncher like Bruselev, I think his name is. Like I said, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I know it's something that starts with a B, and yeah, I'm trying not to confuse it with Brusilov, who was the general during World War One, of course. But the names are very
Yeah.
similar, so that's a trap that you could very easily fall into if you start talking too fast, lose track of what you're saying. So, I'm trying
I
to be
mean,
very
doesn't Shoigu have basically Ms. Medvedev's job or a
yeah.
place above Medvedev?
Like I said, I think at this point with the shuffling, it put him on just about equal footing with Medvedev, where it's like you have Putin and then it's Shoigu and Medvedev, or Medvedev and Shoigu, depending on how you want to say it. Where it's I'm not sure who technically quote unquote outranks who, but in terms of influence and position, they're about equitable now, to my understanding.
Hmm.
But like I said, it has been a little bit of a shift. I think a lot of people were too eager to put emphasis on this, especially considering the fact we haven't even seen the new administration really function in any real capacity for any significant amount of time. So I I'm interested to see what happens with that, but of course that's just the boilerplate facts that you could have heard anywhere else about that. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that.
No, I mean that's about it for me on that issue. I don't know if you. I mean, there's several things now that are happening. In the Middle East. I mean, all to say, basically, I think. In my opinion, the bottom line is Shoigu is still within the security structure. He has another guy replacing him who, like him, was never in the military, right? He's not a military man, right? So, but apparently, like you say, his name is, I know it starts with B. It's a Borisov, but he's apparently a devout Orthodox Christian. He's a numbers guy. He's apparently he's not a finance analyst per se. Like he's not, as far as I know, he wasn't trained to be an economist, but he gave, like he's always been around the periphery of the Putin administration giving economic advice.
Yes.
He was part of some bureau during the end of the Soviet era that was responsible for economy and mathematics, because like for them they were obsessed with mathematics, right? Very high regard for mathematics, and it's kind of like the military, right? Mathematics rules all. It's like listening to Martinov on Draymond. Well, hello, it's me again. My brother does. Mine is pale in comparison to my brother. He does the best Andre Martinov you've ever heard. Hey, oh, that's me again. Um, so, um, now he's very highly respected, and it's probably because the SMO now is bigger. The Russian forces are bigger. They do not outnumber the Ukrainians in all areas, but in some areas they do. In some areas they're even, but like Chesav Yar, they're even. But the main complaints were veterans were not receiving money. Um, so yeah, I mean, he's there basically to treat um, the veterans and the personnel of the SMO as better than what they have been. I don't know how much of this has anything because you see a lot of people posting about, you know, Prigozhin saying, he finally got his wish. I don't think that's what this is. You know, um, Prigozhin wanted like an increase in shells production, and these are the sort of the Soviet era 152 millimeter shells. And Krasnopol shells. How much of this was, you know, um, Russian Central Command sitting on its ass, or how much of it was them adapting, but it was slower. Remember that when Prigozhin were making some of these statements, it was only 11 months or 10 months after the start of the SMO, right? And then he made them a little bit later, like in April and May, when Bakhmut almost fell or had fallen. So, he made those infamous videos. I don't know how much of this is really about like Shoigu getting the last laugh. Some people seem to think it is. I think Russia already understood a year ago that they would have to increase production of Krasnopol bombs, and that's been very effective. New forms of Lancets have, but for storming operations, the Russia, he's wanted Prigozhin wanted more cannon, um, artillery, basically for this job, and that's still the case. Except the problem is, of course, that it's not like World War II, and it's not like the first 6 months of the SMO where you could line up 5, 6, 7 of these cannons and just fire off. They have to be constantly on the move, and that is the main hindrance to why sometimes Russian attacks fail and fail miserably, because the Ukrainians are not going to use their shells basically for attacking. They're in a defensive posture. They simply don't have enough shells, but they will keep them, and they will have very good, accurate shells for destroying, Russian attacks, which tend to vary between like 4 to 6, maybe 7 vehicles. And of course, sometimes these attacks are very successful by the Russians. I saw one recently today that was highlighted by Dima from Military Analysis. But like I say, I don't know how much of this has to do with Prigozhin. Like, it's making me reevaluate like a lot of things about Prigozhin. I'm no more sure than maybe anybody else. I don't know. Like, yeah. I'll leave it there. How much of it was Prigozhin putting the fire under their ass or not? I really don't know. Sometimes I think Prigozhin probably was just heartbroken to see how many of his men were dying storming Bakhmut, and he blamed these guys. But part of that was also because he lost his contracts with. It's a chicken and egg thing. I don't know where it starts because he was making some very strange comments even in January 2023, 11 months into the war. About like, maybe I will march on Moscow. So, he was kind of taking advantage of like a certain amount of discontent. Remember, the Russians had lost Kharkov and then Kherson. Um, they made very good progress in Bakhmut, but it was very bloody. And the final stages were extremely bloody. So it's I wonder if it was a maskarovka or not. But I don't think that's what this is. I think those people who make those statements are probably sincere. I don't think they're arguing in bad faith, but they're probably wrong. I could be wrong too, but it's just that at the moment, I think they're wrong. I think the Russians knew that they would have to ramp things up, and a lot of it is hinges on Putin, not Shoigu. Many of his military advisors urged him to begin conscription in June or July, not the end of September, not September 24th of 2022. So maybe Prigozhin is too afraid to make was too afraid to make that criticism against Putin. So it was safer to make it against Gerasimov. That's another person who doesn't, his position hasn't been changed. So it's got nothing to do with that. You know, like you said, Prigozhin kind of moved up.
Yeah, Shoigu kind
I
of
mean,
moved up.
Shoigu,
I mean,
sorry, Shoigu.
depending on, I don't know, your personal assessment of Prigozhin, maybe he moved up, maybe he even moved a little down. I don't know. I think that's
Oh God.
that is not my place to say. I'll just leave it at that. but but with that being said, I suppose we could move on to probably the most recent breaking news, which is that of Raisi, the president of Iran, and the fact that he has gone missing after a helicopter crash. So it was in the early morning in Iran. He was taking a helicopter to the Azeri border. He was going to some security meeting that I think was actually joint between the Iranians and the Azeris. And it was on the way back that the three helicopters, the helicopter with Raisi and the foreign minister, his name escapes me, went down, and the other two did not go down. But since then, there has been extensive search and rescue operations. Even the Turkish and the Russian authorities have contributed to the search and rescue operation of Raisi. Now, it is worth noting that they were flying in dense fog in a mountainous region. Now, I will say this is somebody with some flight experience. We're only talking like 15 hours on a fixed wing aircraft. But you know what? It's the greatest thing we have to expertise for the time being, so I will speak with what I know. Given what I know, they should not have been flying in those conditions in that area. Flying with instruments is one thing, especially on a fixed wing aircraft, especially at higher altitudes. Like I said, that's one thing. Um, but with a helicopter, with the nature of flight, with the flight path, from what I saw at least. Now I could be missing information here. Please do let me know if anything has come up since then or if I've missed anything. They should not have been flying in those conditions. I don't know whether that was just a misjudgment of the situation, a misjudgment of the weather conditions, whether it was something that urgent where they're willing to risk it. And you actually had sent me a screenshot that is from on the ground in Iran that does show the weather conditions. So I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen just so you guys can get an idea of what it looked like on the ground. On the ground at that, when the helicopter did go down, because that's a pretty thick
It's
fog.
incredibly thick
So
fog, and this is a very mountainous
here's
area.
one screenshot of it, and I'll get the other one up if you have any further
I'll keep
comments
sending
on
you more.
this.
You keep going.
Um, but of course, there has been, I would say, reasonable speculation that this was a sabotage effort. Uh, Given the brazen actions of Israel over the past several months, especially since the 7th of October, it's not out of the question in the slightest that Israel would take an action where they do try to down Raisi's helicopter. I mean, they blew up their embassy in Syria, for
Yeah, yeah.
starters. I don't think this is anything out of the question, I would say. But that's just this on the screen right here, just to give an idea. There's screenshots of videos from Telegram, but these were the search and rescue crews. This is the conditions they were working in all day, and
And this rain forecasted. I'm going to send you. Like I say, very thick fog, turning into rain. These are not. These are horrible conditions. Like just the absolute worst.
in terms of rotary flight, like I said, it's not my area of expertise, certainly not. But with what I know about rotary flight, I don't know how this flight was allowed to take off, especially with the security of the president, which once again does lend credence to the theory that this was some sort of sabotage effort, this was some sort of assassination attempt on Raisi. As it stands now, I believe that they've allegedly made contact with him, but have not found him in his party yet. So, like I
Yeah,
said,
there's a Turkish plane with night vision. Now, there was a phone call from, I believe, either the pilot or one of the ministers who, and then it went dead, and then it came back up. Some more words were exchanged. Now, there was another point uh, where the messaging system. Hang on, please forgive me. So yeah, the Akinci UAV active again. So the Turks have a UAV that is searching for the downed uh, helicopter. I mean, I shouldn't say downed. It's fallen. They're going over this area. I'm gonna send you another picture, just so people understand how mountainous this area is. There's a topographical map. Um, it's very very like I say, very foggy. Um, it was a point where, like I say, where the UAV went off and then it came back on. There was a point where like they were messaging from the crew of the helicopter, and then there wasn't, and then it came back. It, I mean, I'll be honest. I will be very surprised if not most of them are dead.
I would agree. And uh, in this particular case, I'm actually erring on the side of this being just a genuine accident. I would
Yeah.
need to see far more evidence of something like this being an assassination attempt. But I will say one thing that we do need to especially consider given the circumstances, and that is the fact that how close this flight was to Azerbaijan, and the fact that even if the Azeri state had no part in it, Azerbaijan is an Israeli base of operations in many ways. Israel
Yes.
is deeply entrenched in that country, and that if they did want to make something like this happen, they almost certainly have the capability, maybe not under these current conditions, but certainly have the capability to do something like this. So that's not out of the question. But just given the weather, given the conditions,
It,
and given the circumstances of the situation, I would need to see far more evidence pointing towards
yeah,
some sort of malicious involvement before I outright say it is. And I know that my first instinct is to think, oh, what happened? This kind of stuff doesn't just happen. Well, sometimes it does. Bad judgment calls are made, etc. But I know, given the situation, given the tension between Iran and Israel, it is hard to chalk this up to coincidence, or chalk this up to unfortunate circumstances for IEZ. But as it stands now, it's the most plausible explanation. Like I said, I'm fully willing to be proven wrong on this, but
yeah, yeah.
I would need to see far more before I commit myself to that position.
Let's say it was taken up by a missile attack, right? I think then you would not have had the pilot or one of the ministers calling Tehran.
Well, I do think that we're missing one key component here.
Mm.
Israel has a heart machine. They made the fog. I mean,
That's
it was fine, clear conditions when they took off. But
no.
the Mossad deployed the heart machine in
This
Azerbaijan.
stop. Oh, I know. Yeah, I know. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to get into it.
Look,
It was a very bad thing that happened in Syria and Turkey last year. Um, I I
look.
know,
Okay,
I know.
the heart machine is one thing. The earthquake machine, that's quackery. I will have none of that.
I know,
That's
but
where I draw the line, actually. Weather manipulation, yeah.
I think this was just
you know. But yeah,
like you say, if they wanted to, like, it's not cynical to accuse Israel of doing this. Of course, Israel would do something like this. Israel wants to draw Iran into the war. All right, you're having disagreements right now between Gantz and Netanyahu. Okay, and it has not been a good week for the Israeli military. They lost four, then two soldiers up in the north. The main issue between Gantz and other members of the Knesset that are in Netanyahu's party is what are we going to do with the people in the north? And Netanyahu was said, don't scare the people. Stop talking about the north. We have to deal with Gaza right now. So they're in a bit of disarray. And then four soldiers were killed. Another one was killed in Gaza. Then the next day, another one was killed. And then probably the most ridiculous one, five IDF soldiers were killed by friendly fire by a tank, by one of their own tanks. And the tank probably thought they were Palestinian children. And oh well. Tanks have a right to defend themselves.
so true.
Anyways, that is a bit of a mess, right? And I mean, Israel is just going to keep doing stuff until they make Iran overreact, right? Because time is not on Israel's side, right? If it was, they wouldn't be doing this.
I would say also on top of the idea that the Israelis were responsible for this. Like I said, while I'm not writing that out wholesale because I think it's fully within their capability, given what they did in the M scene, given the retaliatory strikes they made against the Iranians, it would be a far more brazen move, I think, if they were going to do something like this. They would make their
Mm-hmm.
mark. They would be like, we're firing on that helicopter. We are doing whatever operations needed to try to take out Raisi. And I do think that this also would have been followed up by rhetoric that his government's illegitimate, that Raisi it has no business in power, that the Iranian regime has no business. And now I know they've employed that rhetoric before, but I think there would have been a strong lead up to that rhetoric in order to say justify it both internally and externally before they made such an action, and they would have been extremely brazen about this, given what they're trying to do, given what Netanyahu in particular is trying to do. So the idea of just some covert assassination operation doesn't really follow. And I think that the idea of a covert assassination operation is also a little bit out of the wheelhouse of the CIA these days. Maybe, say, 20, 30 years ago, that might be something they pull off. But given how much the organization has changed, at least in function, I don't think it's the kind of operation they pull anymore. Now,
I personally think this is a bone of contention between the Americans and the
oh,
Israelis, and that is,
absolutely.
America does not want to get involved in a war with
No,
Iran.
in 2024, an election year, no
No,
way in hell do they. But
no, and like I say, Israel can use the methodology that I was describing earlier of making a state look like an incompetent loser, weak state where all its leaders always get killed, and it's a de facto victory, anyways, right? Like, and then that can make it ripe for a color revolution. If it seems like the state has lost all dignity, it's ineffective, it's weak, um, that can work over a certain period of time. But if you see the footage from people in Tehran and other areas, like people are on the streets, they're praying, just thousands of them.
I
So,
was informed by very reliable sources that they were celebrating.
now,
You know,
of course, there are like some Kurds, even though the representative for Kurds in Iran, um, did, of course, made very supportive statements and hopes and prayers to find the president and the Raisi and the ministers and for a good outcome. But yeah, of course, there are I saw footage of IDF soldiers dancing to an Arabic song celebrating their potential death. Of course, you're going to have those people, liberal
well, to quote
Iranians.
the official Twitter account of the state of Israel, "We will dance again."
No, they really said that.
They did. I can try to
Oh
pull
my
it up. I
God.
can look for it, but that is they've said that multiple times since
Tell,
October
t- tell
7th.
me, tell me you were involved in 911, but without telling me you were involved.
I don't know. I saw all kinds of stuff. It's like, oh, New York on high security alert after afterwards. Stuff like that. But no, that is something the official Israeli account has said. And of course, you have the assorted shills coming out and saying that, oh well, the Iranians are actually very happy about this, and that this is going to be finally be the thing that kicks off the counter revolution, brings back a free and secular Iran or whatever
Oh,
fantasy
whatever.
they have of pre 1979 Iran. But uh, I would say add one thing going back to Israel in terms of the predicament they're in. Now, I don't think anything will come of it, but you do have Egyptian posturing on the border. You do have a military buildup on the
Mm-hmm.
border. And one might say, well, no, they wouldn't risk it. Of course, they wouldn't risk it. But we do have to remember that Sisi is in power. That in many ways he is at the whim of popular will in Egypt, which is part of the reason why he has been conciliatory towards. Okay, maybe conciliatory isn't the right word, but the reason he hasn't touched the Israeli issue is because he didn't want to involve Egypt in a deeper crisis, which would be sure to garner him an unpopularity. But now that, of course, Israel has thrown that first punch, and not even directly against Egypt, but just in this fight overall, that popular opinion against Israel is souring even more than it already had, say, in a country like Egypt. That he is expected to show some posturing against the Israelis. And I mean, I don't think that CC will give the order to go into Gaza tonight by no means, but we do have to consider that it just does take one overzealous officer in order to cause a crisis. And we've seen this many times before. And that could be on the Israeli side, that could be on the Egyptian side. But
Mm-hmm.
like I said, if there's, and I know Egypt and Israel have had their showdowns before, and Israel has come out victorious in them, but given the shift in circumstances, given the lack of confidence in Israel, given that the myth of invincibility is busted, barring the Samson option, because that is always the thing, Israel could always press the red button. I do think that we are actually at a unique point where if Egypt were, by some stretch of the imagination, were to go in, that they could actually see success in this, or at least forcing some sort of settlement on Israel. Like I said, not that I think that will happen, not that I even think it necessarily should happen, but in terms of, let's just say, power disparity between Egypt and Israel, I think it's the closest it's been in decades. And I do think because of that, we could see some very interesting results come out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, as they say, the Arabic street, he has to do something. Um,
and
but like you, I don't think anything is gonna come of it.
just
The other.
just some
Go ahead.
recent this is from Telegram, according to Press TV, that they have located Raizi's helicopter, and you have rescuers approaching the scene. Like I said, this is according to Press TV, and allegedly they did find wreckage, but nothing has been officially confirmed. So this
Oh no.
as of 10:18 p.m. on May 19th, 2024, Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time. Excuse me. So that is the information we're dealing with now. It'd probably be um, either the end of the night, very early hours in the morning in Iran. So if this report is true, but like I said, that is just one thing I will throw out there. That does seem like some progress has been made. Not that I take Press TV at their word, but I think in terms of sensationalism, that on an issue like this, probably, of course, it is susceptible to it, but it's not going to be one of those things where updates come out every 5 minutes that are completely contradictory to each other, especially in their English language media. It's not that hot button of story. This isn't exactly some sort of Western media story we're talking about here, but um, you can keep an eye on that. In terms of also just going back to the assassination theory, I know that the Israelis, of course, be trying to provoke a wider response and trying to escalate the situation in hopes that the Americans get involved and bail them out. But while it always is a hit to stability to have your head of state die in any circumstance, it's not like there's a lack of a line of succession. They've replaced people before. He has second commands. There is an entire regime structure around this. You still have the entire structure of the Islamic Republic with the clerical officials, with the ayatollahs, and that is separate from the office of president. So
Yeah,
this
people have
isn't
to
this isn't
remember
some
that.
crippling blow to the Iranians, even if it were worst case scenario.
Right, right. It's only an aggregate of these things happening. If you start with like Soleimani, then the embassy. It was actually the consulate next to the embassy, but I mean that's in a way that's a distinction without a difference.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's just hair splitting.
yeah. So you know, it's a way, it's a demoralization. That it's a demoralization technique. Statecraft demoralization. That's what this is. And I almost think that they probably know what happened, but um, they want people to sort of arrive at a point on their own that you know all the crew and the passengers are dead, or most of them are dead, including Raisi. And I guess we'll find out eventually, and it won't be that long when we do, and we'll probably get a better idea if this was sabotage or not. Now, again, I think it was probably just a mistake. They should never have flown under these circumstances. It doesn't mean there's no possibility that something was done to the helicopter, but as is often the case, for security purposes, dignitaries, there's three choppers. They can change it and often do at the last moment about which chopper they're going to get into. Um, you know, um, Tampering with three helicopters is a lot harder than tampering with one. So I think we're probably going to find out that we could be wrong, but I think we're probably going to find out that this is a horrible mistake.
Yeah, and
And
especially in sabotage, like three helicopters. That's well, I know it's a 33% chance, but that still is a lucky guess if somebody were to sabotage them ahead of time. The fact that that's the helicopter that Raisi and his foreign minister are going to be on.
right, and it's like I said, and it's often the case that they switch at the last moment. So, you know, um, I guess we'll know very soon, uh, including the possibility if some ground to air missile was used, some kind of a man pad to take it down. But again, if that had happened, I don't think we would have seen. We wouldn't have heard, if we believe the reports, messages coming from the crew of the helicopter. I just, I can't see because the explosion itself would have been so devastating. There's far less likelihood that that would have happened.
Yeah, that's. I agree that while I wouldn't, while I'm not ruling out the idea of sabotage or an assassination attempt in principle, given the facts of the situation, it's nowhere near enough for me to make that determination.
Yeah.
But unless you have any last minute stories, that's all I had.
Uh, no, no, that's all I have. The it was a lieutenant of the Ukrainian Air Force that was shot down, apparently, and I believe that it was another commander. But anyhow, I mean, these aren't his last name started with an L. It's not like these names are names that we're going to remember, but yes. So very action-packed week. A lot of you know quickly escalating scenarios, geopolitically and politically. Um, I imagine we are going to see probably attempted coups and assassinations much more as things heat up, much more as time runs out.
Absolutely, it's on the table now. I think that Nord Stream was actually a pivotal moment in terms of this, in terms of let's just say action, state versus state actions in terms of geopolitical disagreements, and in a way that we have not seen in the post-war era, I'll say at least,
Yeah,
and that a lot of taboos are being broken, a lot of lines are being crossed that were not previously crossed, and that will lead to more more of that, more flare-ups, if you will, and the gloves are coming off on all sides, and it's a dangerous time, it's a volatile time, but to be hopelessly optimistic, it's also a time of opportunity, as we've seen with the actions by Orban and his meeting with Xi Jinping, and like I said, other political machinations and geopolitical machinations that we've seen. While it is an extremely dangerous situation, there is good that can be garnered out of this. It's just that it needs to be played very carefully, or else this all could quite literally blow up in all of our faces.
yeah.
But that is what I had today. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll certainly be back in the near future. And we'll see you guys then, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.